Retomamos la sesión. Tenemos la suerte de contar, pedimos disculpas porque llevamos un poquito de retraso. Javier Díaz Noci está ya presente, está conectado, pero tiene el micrófono desactivado. No sé si tiene que activarlo él o... Ah, vale, él lo puede activar, perfecto. Paso, por lo tanto, a la presentación. Javier Díaz Noci es licenciado y doctor en Periodismo por la Universidad del País Vasco, además de licenciado y doctor en Derecho por la misma universidad. Es catedrático de Comunicación en la Universidad Pompeu Fabra de Barcelona. Ha sido investigador visitante en las universidades de Reno, Nevada, Estados Unidos, Oxford y la Universidad Federal de Bahía, en Brasil. Sus principales intereses de investigación son tres: periodismo en línea, noticias y noticias en línea, historia del periodismo, especialmente prensa en euskera y redes de noticias de la Edad Moderna, y derechos de autor y reportajes de noticias. Es autor de una bibliografía prodigiosamente extensa, en la que destacan libros como El nacimiento del periodismo vasco, Gacetas donostiarras de los siglos XVII y XVIII, junto a Mercedes del Hoyo, publicado en 2003. Les animo a que, si no lo conocen, busquen en Internet, porque la producción y la bibliografía generada por Javier Díaz Noci es enorme, intensa e interesantísima. Y sin más, le doy la palabra y le doy las gracias por haber aceptado la propuesta de Carmen para participar en este seminario. Gracias.
¿Dónde está aquí la configuración? ¿Lo he botado? No, ¿no? ¿Tiene cable? ¿Sí nos escucha? ¿Nos escucha? ¿Hola? ¿Puede usted hablar?
Hola.
Ahora. La cámara porque la tenemos oscura. Qué bien me lo paso aquí con esto. Sí, nosotros le estamos viendo. Otra cosa es que usted no nos ve a nosotros. Cámara integrada.
Hola.
Esta es la cámara.
Se congela la imagen.
No va la cámara. ¿Sale el primer plano?
No va.
Vale. Bueno, vamos a ver. Aunque no nos vea a nosotros, podemos escucharlo, ¿vale? ¿Usted nos escucha?
No sé si me veis y si me oís.
Verlo sí que lo vemos.
Pero
usted
yo
no nos
veo
ve a
la imagen
nosotros.
de dos técnicos con mascarilla congelada.
Congelado, vale. Vale,
Bueno,
nosotros
si
sí
queréis
que
lo hacemos a ciegas.
Eso es, nosotros sí que lo escuchamos a usted.
Voy pasando la presentación y voy hablando.
Eso es, nosotros sí que lo escuchamos a usted. Vamos a compartir la presentación y vamos a intentar solucionar esto de la cámara, ¿vale?
Bueno, ¿qué hago?
Espérate.
Procedo a ciegas. Yo no escucho nada ni veo nada, ¿eh? O sea, estoy a ciegas. De acuerdo, pues entonces empiezo. Bien, en primer lugar, quería agradecer la invitación muy amable de la Universidad de Sevilla y de los organizadores de este segundo coloquio. El primero fue en Besançon, ahora es en Sevilla. Me hubiese gustado extraordinariamente estar allí, hubiésemos evitado algunos problemas técnicos también, pero estoy hasta el 30 de noviembre en el Reino Unido. Ya ha sido suficientemente complicado salir de España, entrar en el Reino Unido, y ahora es muy complicado salir de nuevo del Reino Unido, entrar en España y volver, porque aquí es donde estoy con mi familia hasta el 30 de noviembre. Lamento no poder estar con ustedes, no es la mejor solución, ya sé que estos problemas técnicos acontecen. Bueno, si ustedes me escuchan bien, pues vamos adelante. El título de esta intervención mía es El negocio de las noticias en la Europa de 1621. Actually, I was tempted to deliver my presentation in English, or in a tentative English at least, since my colleague Paul Arboster doesn't speak Spanish as far as I know, and it's probably better to proceed in his language. But actually what I decided to do is to speak in Spanish. The audience is mainly Spanish native language, and I've prepared a long presentation, a complete one, I mean, with a lot of kind of subtitles in English, so Paul Arboster or people from the international scholarly community can follow me properly. Please feel free to ask any question to me in both Spanish or in English as well. El título de mi presentación es este en inglés, aunque probablemente sería más correcto hablar del negocio de las noticias en España acerca, más o menos, en 1621. El esquema de mi presentación va a ser el siguiente. Primero voy a hablar de las diferentes figuras o división del trabajo alrededor de las noticias, básicamente impresas en Europa y singularmente en España, más o menos en 1621. A continuación voy a hablar de qué significaba editar, en el sentido sobre todo inglés del término, periódicos noticiosos en España alrededor de esa fecha, y finalmente haré una pequeña conclusión acerca de qué es lo que sabemos y qué es lo que no sabemos acerca del negocio de publicar noticias en Europa, básicamente alrededor de 1621. Probablemente algunas de las cosas que expondré son afortunadamente coincidentes con lo que han explicado mis compañeros esta mañana, y yo creo que va a reforzar este mismo discurso. El primer punto, como decía, se refiere a los diferentes oficios alrededor de la difusión de noticias, la difusión profesional o semiprofesional de noticias en la Europa de 1621. Y yo diría que al menos podríamos distinguir entre impresores, lo que en inglés se denomina publishers, lo que en inglés se denomina editors. Recurro al inglés porque se diferencia muy bien entre publishers y editors, y lo que serían los que materializan, los que escriben, traducen, adaptan, reordenan las noticias en la Europa de esta época. Seguramente podríamos añadir dos figuras que yo creo que son muy importantes, que son la de los inversores, en sentido muy amplio, ¿de acuerdo? Es decir, quienes pagan por las noticias, y los clientes de estas noticias, sean manuscritas, sean incluso orales, sean sobre todo, que es a lo que nos vamos a referir, las noticias impresas. Es decir, yo creo que nos deberíamos preocupar también por la gente, no solamente que produce las noticias, sino por la gente que consume las noticias y que paga por ello. ¿De acuerdo? Tanto sea el consumidor último, el que compra, por ejemplo, un papel noticioso, como el que paga para que se le informe acerca de ello. Y aquí habría una diferencia entre las noticias manuscritas, generalmente, pero no solo ni necesariamente privadas, y las noticias impresas. En las noticias impresas hay un cliente último que paga en el punto último, mientras que en las noticias manuscritas privadas, en principio privadas, lo que hay es alguien que invierte para que se le informe personalmente. Vamos a ir viéndolo a continuación. Igualmente creo que es importante comprender cómo funcionaba el negocio de las noticias, el negocio de diseminar noticias, de informar a la población o determinadas capas de la población en 1621. Y para ello creo que es conveniente que nos concentremos tanto en la producción de noticias como en la reproducción de noticias, en la distribución de noticias y en el consumo de noticias en Europa en principio. Podríamos añadir seguramente parte de Asia, singularmente Japón, aunque no vamos a entrar en ello, y seguramente ya en este momento y sobre todo unas décadas después en la América de lengua española, especialmente en México y también en Lima. Y creo que nos van a hablar mañana exactamente sobre esto. Y menos en la América de lengua portuguesa, en lo que hoy es Brasil, por una diferente razón, porque las prensas, la imprenta estaba prohibida entonces. Había un cierto consumo de noticias, pero no había una impresión de noticias en la América de lengua portuguesa, salvo tal vez, aunque parece descartado, en los pocos años en que un par de ciudades, Salvador de Bahía y Recife en Pernambuco, están bajo el dominio holandés. Y por tanto, y poniendo el acento en las personas, yo creo que nos interesa discernir cómo eran, no tanto quiénes, que no siempre es posible determinarlo, sino cómo eran al menos los productores y reproductores de noticias, cómo eran aquellos que las diseminaban y cómo eran los consumidores de las noticias en Europa. Por el contrario, y cuando hacemos historia sobre todo del periodismo, de los medios, nos concentramos en los impresores, y durante un tiempo podría haber parecido que eran solo los impresores quienes se dedicaban al negocio de las noticias. En realidad había otros agentes importantes, había bastantes más agentes importantes, aunque desde luego no podemos menospreciar la importancia de los impresores como, y vuelvo a recurrir a inglés, publishers de noticias. Cosa que no eran en todos los casos. Esto también me interesa recalcarlo. Luego vamos a ver algunos casos concretos y vamos a ver que un impresor no siempre era quien publicaba las noticias, sino que a veces, en muchas ocasiones, era quien meramente las reimprimía. Esto no carece de importancia, pero creo que es conveniente delimitar los oficios que se estaban ya en 1621 decantando en torno al negocio de las noticias. En muchos casos eran reproductores y solamente hasta cierto punto al menos, y depende de los casos, esto me interesa recalcarlo, adaptadores, traductores o, y esto es un término importante, recopiladores o compiladores de noticias. Voy a insistir en ello inmediatamente ahora. La recopilación o la compilación de noticias parece ser un término importante desde muy antiguo, porque de hecho así se denominó al primer, lo he puesto entre comillas, periodista conocido. El primer periodista conocido se llamaba Crestus, o Cresto, y era una persona de la cual conocemos el nombre, y era una persona a quien Marco Celio Rufus, que actuaba por encargo de Cicerón y de su editor Ático, era remunerado para recoger noticias en el foro en el año 58 a.C. ¿De acuerdo? Es decir, que el primer oficio que conocemos por el cual se remunera a alguien para que recoja y probablemente elabore, al menos en bruto, noticias que luego se sirven a un cliente final a través de intermediarios como Marco Celio Rufo o Ático. El cliente final era Cicerón, es decir, un político importante en esos momentos. Él estaba en esos momentos destinado a gobernar Cilicia, en el Asia Menor, y estaba interesado en saber lo que se decía en general y sobre todo de él en el foro romano. Es un tal Cresto. Solo conocemos el nombre, pero es importante que veamos cuál es el esquema inicial del negocio de las noticias en la antigua Roma. Hay un patrono, que en este caso es Cicerón, alguien que paga por las noticias porque está interesado en ello. Vamos a ver este esquema, ha aparecido en las presentaciones de esta mañana, por ejemplo, con los comerciantes, con los mercaderes o con los nobles o con las élites dirigentes, tanto comerciales como nobiliarias, de la Europa de los siglos XV al XVIII, probablemente. Luego están los clientes y amigos, amici, en latín, que son gente de un cierto estatus social que se dedica, por un interés cierto, a recopilar noticias para ese patrón. Y luego finalmente están los obreros, los operarios, los escritores finalmente de noticias. ¿De acuerdo? Este sería el esquema que se decanta en la antigua Roma y que hasta cierto punto aparece, creo yo, y podríamos discutir en la Europa de 1621. ¿Hasta qué punto este esquema está funcionando también en 1621 o estamos asistiendo a un paso hacia otro tipo de noticias más moderno? Es una cuestión que podríamos examinar, por ejemplo, con el caso de Felipe May, que es el impresor de esa gaceta semiperiódica de la que se ha hablado también esta mañana en el coloquio, que Carmen Espejo redescubrió en un archivo italiano porque se pensaban que eran números sueltos de noticias individuales, de relaciones de noticias, cuando en realidad es un corpus que tiende a la periodicidad, y que hemos editado con un estudio preliminar, Rafael Soto, la propia Carmen Espejo y yo mismo. Por tanto, el oficio de recopilar o de reunir noticias, de compilar noticias, parece estar en la base de todo el entramado empresarial, ¿por qué no hablar así?, de estos orígenes del periodismo. De recopilar noticias y de editarlas, de nuevo en el sentido anglosajón del término, es decir, de elaborarlas para servirlas a un público final por un precio determinado, sea una remuneración en dinero, económica directamente, o de otro tipo, que sería el caso, como hemos examinado y como ha dicho el profesor Lunes esta mañana, de determinadas élites muy importantes de la Europa de la época. Por tanto, de editar y de arreglar noticias, de adaptarlas también para determinados mercados generalmente locales. Esto incluye adaptarlas, reordenarlas y, desde luego, traducirlas para los mercados locales. Y esta parece ser la principal actividad social alrededor de las noticias. Voy a subrayar lo de la actividad social porque esto nos lleva, o al menos me lleva a mí, a determinadas decisiones metodológicas. Esto a mí me lleva a una historia social de las noticias. Como saben, la historia social es una corriente social que se pone en boga sobre todo en la Inglaterra, en el Reino Unido, de los años 60 y 70. Para otros campos, pero que, digamos, se extrapola también a la historia cultural, y yo creo que se podría aplicar a la actividad noticiosa, a la actividad informativa, o, si prefieren, a la historia de los medios, a la historia del periodismo. Esto quiere decir que no ponemos el foco solo o primordialmente en los medios de comunicación, en los títulos, sino en las personas, en la gente, en los grupos sociales alrededor de este negocio informativo. Incluso, y esto nos lleva a una severa limitación metodológica, aunque en muchísimos casos es imposible saber prácticamente nada, sobre todo sobre la gente ordinaria, es decir, la gente que consume noticias, pero también la gente que las escribe, de los operarios, de los trabajadores, por así decirlo, de los escritores, de los periodistas, aunque no se denominan así, de los gaceteros de la época, con algunas excepciones. Sí conocemos los nombres de impresores, de publishers, de algunos editores, no todos, ¿de acuerdo? Y sobre todo de los clientes finales, de la gente, de los inversores que pagan por las noticias manuscritas. Esa élite de la que hemos hablado, de la que se ha hablado esta mañana. Pero es difícil saber o conocer nada o poco del perfil de la gente ordinaria que consumía o producía esas noticias. Por el contrario, yo estoy convencido de que necesitamos de alguna manera poner el foco también en ellos y en ellas, hasta el punto al menos de que algunas mujeres producían noticias. Hay algunos casos en Andalucía concretamente de relacioneras, cuyo nombre sí conocemos, y conocemos también algo acerca de su perfil. De ellos ideas si pretendemos obtener algún tipo de conocimiento acerca de cómo funcionaba el negocio de las noticias en la Europa de la Guerra de los 30 años. Si bien esto proyecta numerosos retos metodológicos. De algunos de ellos, solamente de algunos, hemos tratado la profesora Carmen Espejo y yo en este artículo al que me remito, si quieren conocer un poco cómo creemos que era el modelo de negocio, de la propiedad de los medios, la relación con el poder y cómo se iban decantando esos oficios alrededor, sobre todo de los periódicos o de los papeles de noticias, de los newspapers de la época. Para una época un poco más tardía, ya en la España, claramente en Europa, del último tercio, del último cuarto del siglo XVII, ya podemos advertir una decantación mucho más clara de cómo se estructuraba el negocio de las noticias. Conocemos algunos publishers de noticias bien conocidos. Uno de ellos es Johann von den Bigden, que como saben era el encargado de los servicios postales, a partir de los cuales en 1615 puede editar el Frankfurter Postzeitung, que es uno de los primeros periódicos de Europa, periódicos conocidos, con periodicidad establecida. ¿De acuerdo? Él trabajó tanto en Suecia como en Alemania. Otro editor conocido, voy a pasar muy de puntillas porque Paul Armbruster va a hablar mucho mejor que yo, es Abraham Verhoeven, ¿de acuerdo? En Amberes, alrededor de 1605. Él produce mucho y produce muy bien. Se dice que él es el primero que incorpora la información gráfica en los periódicos, no en las publicaciones noticiosas individuales, pero sí en los periódicos de la época, y este es un ejemplo. Él trabaja, como saben, en varios idiomas, ¿de acuerdo? Otros casos bastante bien conocidos son los de la Inglaterra, en Londres, de alrededor de 1620 y 1621, que es cuando se publican los periódicos, los primeros periódicos o publicaciones con una cierta regularidad al menos. Está bastante bien descrito tanto en la literatura académica como en la ficción. Nathaniel Butter y sus colegas Nicholas Bourne, William Shepard y otros, en determinados momentos constituyen una joint venture o un syndicate en el significado anglosajón del término, descritos con todas las reservas en The Staple of News, el comercio de noticias de Ben Jonson, en 1625. Por lo tanto, estamos en la época alrededor de 1621. Este es Ben Jonson, un dramaturgo contemporáneo de William Shakespeare, no tan bueno como él, amigo de él. Y es interesante tanto esta obra, The Staple of News, de 1625, como una que le precede, que es de 1620. Por tanto, del año anterior a 1621. El título es más largo, es News from the New World Discovered in the Moon. Es más corta, es una mascarada para representar en la corte. ¿De acuerdo? En la corte inglesa. The Staple of News se representa en el teatro para el pueblo llano y para los nobles, pero The News from the New World está directamente dirigida solo a la corte británica, la corte inglesa en aquel momento. En esta mascarada, Johnson describe algunos de los primeros oficios y les da nombre relacionados con el negocio de las noticias. Factor of News, que era el que escribía las noticias, el que escribía cartas de noticias, newsletters, más de 100 al día, llega a decir en esa mascarada. El cronista, de acuerdo que es un oficio que ya entonces está en desuso, pero que se encuentra amenazado por el naciente comercio de noticias, y el impresor, ¿de acuerdo? En 1620, antes de los primeros papeles periódicos o semiperiódicos que se publican en Londres, estos son los oficios que se advierten, o que Ben Jonson advierte. Ben Jonson y otros comienzan a darse cuenta de la importancia de la transición del nuevo mundo hacia el nuevo mundo, de la sociedad antigua a la sociedad moderna. Unos años después se producirá la Revolución Inglesa, ¿de acuerdo? Habrá una Commonwealth, una especie de república, el rey perderá la cabeza, literalmente, ¿de acuerdo? Y se producirá una transición hacia la primera revolución de Europa, que es la Revolución Inglesa. Ben Jonson se da cuenta del hambre de las noticias, de la avidez de noticias, que también han mencionado mis colegas esta mañana, y de la emergencia de una nueva clase social que aspira a gobernar, ¿de acuerdo? Que aspira a tener su papel en la nueva sociedad, que no es necesariamente la clase terrateniente, la clase aristocrática, la clase noble. Y esta nueva clase social es la burguesía comercial. Esta burguesía comercial es obvio que va a tener una importancia determinante y crucial en el panorama informativo y en la configuración del negocio, de los medios de comunicación. Y aquí vemos una tensión también entre el público privado y el interés público y el interés privado. De alguna manera, Jonson, yo creo que sin saberlo, está describiendo la emergencia de la opinión pública en Inglaterra y de alguna manera en el mundo conocido, tanto en la Europa continental como en las colonias, tanto inglesas como españolas como portuguesas en América. Si tienen algún interés o alguna curiosidad por conocer esos primerísimos textos ingleses que empiezan a describir el comercio de noticias, yo los he editado en doble edición inglesa y castellana, con una traducción seguramente muy mejorable, pero que servirá para estos propósitos. Es de libre disposición y está en esta dirección web, ¿de acuerdo? Junto con obras de Ben Jonson, las dos mencionadas, y otras de James Shirley, de John Fletcher, de Richard Braithwaite y también de Donald Lupton. Son muy curiosas, ¿de acuerdo? Y seguramente habrá más, tanto en inglés como en otras lenguas, en francés, seguramente en italiano, en menor medida en español, que nos empiecen a hablar de todos estos extremos. Hemos hablado de los publishers of news, pero también hay editors of news. Yo creo que el primero conocido, se ha hablado bastante de él, es Thomas Gainsford, a quien también se conoce como Captain Pamphlet, el capitán panfleto. También lo satiriza Ben Jonson. Pero Thomas Gainsford no es un personaje risible, es un personaje muy importante, porque es el primero que conscientemente edita noticias, es decir, que recopila noticias, las traduce, las adapta, he merged all of them, y las sirve a un público determinado con una intención muy clara de ir configurando una opinión pública, en su caso en el Londres y en la Inglaterra de alrededor de 1620. A él se debe este opúsculo, fíjense en el título, The Secretary's Study. Es una colección epistolar típicamente inglesa, tratando de enseñar mediante el ejemplo, learning by doing. Este es el índice y fíjense que un apartado entero con muchos ejemplos probablemente reales tomados de las noticias que él recopilaba, adaptaba, traducía, redactaba de nuevo para un público local. Él le llama nuncupatory or letters of news. Perdóname mi muy mal inglés, ¿de acuerdo? Nuncupatory or letter of news. Letras, cartas de noticias. Es clara la importancia del género epistolar, por tanto que viene del género manuscrito, en la constitución no solamente del producto y del público, sino también del oficio. Aquí hay un ejemplo, pero hay otros varios. Esto, de alguna manera, también configura la manera en que desde el mundo de habla inglesa se va a enseñar el news writing. Y esto llega hasta nuestros días, el learning by doing. Desde luego, el término secretario parece ser un término clave y esto nos va a ofrecer algunas pistas acerca de cómo eran, no de quiénes eran, sino de cómo eran al menos los factors, como decía Ben Jonson, o los autores de noticias, o si se quiere, los compiladores y editores y quizá periodistas en sentido muy extenso. Tanto es así que en el mundo mediterráneo, de la Europa continental, también hay otro, digamos, manual para secretarios, es decir, para gente que trabaja para el poder, para esas nuevas élites aristocráticas, para embajadores, para militares incluso, para religiosos que están alrededor de las cortes, también la papal, alrededor del poder. Y es este, Pánfilo Pérsico, que publica, si no me equivoco, en 1616, es decir, en el mismo año que publica Thomas Gainsford su The Secretary's Study en Londres, él publica en Venecia, esto es una edición posterior, del secretario. La primera edición, perdón el error, es de 1620. Gainsford publica en 1616, año en que muere Shakespeare, año en que muere Miguel de Cervantes. El manual de Pánfilo Pérsico no se detiene solo en plantear ejemplos como Gainsford, sino que habla de cómo se deberían hacer los avisos, las cartas de avisos, lettere di avvisi en italiano. Es claro que este manual se conocía en toda la Europa continental y desde luego se conocía en España. Si tienen curiosidad, y aun a riesgo de hacerme un poco de autobombo, trato de estas cuestiones en este artículo, aquí tienen la URL, es de libre acceso. Por tanto, mientras que hemos puesto el foco en los impresores o en los publishers, yo creo que no estamos dando la importancia que merecen a otras figuras y a otros aspectos del negocio de las noticias como se estaba configurando ya en 1621. Y vamos a ver un ejemplo que es casi el primero conocido, aunque hay otros, que es el de Felipe Mey en Valencia, alrededor de estos mismos años. Hay otros también en otras ciudades, claramente en Sevilla o en Barcelona, probablemente en Madrid, quizá en Valladolid. Voy a hacer otra vez autobombo, me van a perdonar. Carmen Espejo, a quien se debe todo el mérito de haber descubierto o redescubierto este grupo de publicaciones periódicas. Rafael Soto y yo mismo hemos publicado, también es de libre acceso, ¿de acuerdo? No estoy protegiendo el negocio, estoy dando difusión a lo que hacemos. Este libro que está en PDF, en el cual hemos editado y hemos hecho un estudio preliminar sobre esta primera gaceta que se publica en España. En realidad que se reimprime en España, porque está claro que es una reimpresión sin traducción, una mera reimpresión de una gaceta, no sabemos si periódica, semiperiódica o regular, que se imprimió en Roma. Y también esto es de la semana pasada, he tratado para el público de habla inglesa en este capítulo de este libro que se acaba de lanzar al mercado, para poner el autobombo. Por tanto, cuando nos fijamos exclusivamente o primordialmente en los impresores, tendemos a privilegiar las noticias impresas sobre otro tipo de noticias, sobre la oralidad o sobre las cartas manuscritas, que como os he dicho son tremendamente importantes. Claramente para el caso italiano, el profesor Mario Infelice, en unos trabajos todos ellos magníficos, ha estudiado las noticias manuscritas en Venecia y en otras ciudades, pero existían también impresas en la época. Claramente lo que se reimprime en Valencia. Y desde luego nos interesa destacar que todas estas formas conviven. De esto ha hablado también, entre otros autores, Fernando Bouza o Michele Olivari, en este libro igualmente magnífico. Desde luego la información adopta formatos que van mucho más allá de lo que tratamos en la historia del periodismo. Efectivamente es más cómodo, hasta cierto punto, hablar de la historia del periodismo y sobre todo de la historia de los periódicos, de las publicaciones periódicas. Pero hay muchas más formas, sobre todo en este momento inicial que situamos convencionalmente alrededor de 1621. Por tanto, no es en absoluto infrecuente que muchas noticias primero se escribiesen a mano y después se imprimiesen también. Por ejemplo, para el caso español, y no es el único, el de Andrés de Almansa y Mendoza, que ha sido estudiado por Manuel Borrego y Henry Ettingausen de forma magnífica. Estos dos libros son fundamentales para conocer esa primera industria informativa, no solamente en España, sino en la Europa de la época, y para contextualizarlo en toda su complejidad. Vamos al segundo apartado, espero ir bien de tiempo, que es cómo se editaban las publicaciones noticiosas en la España de 1621. De nuevo, aquí me viene mejor, perdónenme, no quiero ser pedante, el término inglés, editing newspapers, porque newspapers aquí entraría todo lo que son papeles de noticias, sean impresos o no, y sean periódicos o no. Y el término to edit también me va mejor, porque va más allá de lo que es meramente imprimir, incluye más cosas, aquellas cosas que hacía, por ejemplo, Thomas Gainsford en la época. Antes de 1621 es seguro que determinadas clases sociales estaban involucradas en esta actividad de intercambio y consumo de noticias, pero esto empieza a ir más allá. Conocemos para el caso de España, y no solo de España, el de Girolamo di Somaya, que en 1603-1607 es un estudiante en Salamanca. Leer sus diarios es una maravilla porque era francamente un tipo muy fresco. ¿De acuerdo? Era un fresh student de la época. Pero para lo que nos interesa, él menciona el intercambio de numerosas gacetas, así la denomina él en italiano, desde luego manuscritas y alguna probablemente impresa, 1603, 1607, y por tanto un cierto intercambio de material noticioso entre Italia y España, y dentro de España en determinadas poblaciones. Estos son los títulos que él menciona, son títulos tentativos: Gaceta de Roma, Gaceta de Italia, Gaceta et Relatione y la Gaceta Española, se supone que redactada en español, y las Nuove di Valladolid y di Salamanca. La corte, si no me equivoco, entonces estaba en Valladolid, por tanto no lejos de Salamanca. Estos títulos, tal cual, hoy no son desconocidos, tanto en formato impreso como en formato manuscrito. No sabemos, no los conocemos. Probablemente los nombraba de manera aproximada, pero estaría bien poder disponer o poder descubrir en alguna biblioteca. Efectivamente, la digitalización avanza y se están descubriendo muchísimas cosas. Pero es claro que había material informativo y que había un público, al menos entre las élites con las que se codeaba Girolamo di Somaya a principios del siglo XVII, ya en España. En 1621 llega este buen señor. Este buen señor es Felipe IV, ¿de acuerdo? Él accede a la corona de España y de Portugal, es decir, que reúne en su regia testa dos coronas, dos reinos, en 1621 exactamente. Y muere en 1665, que es un poquito después de cuando se empieza a expandir el negocio de las publicaciones, ahora sí periódicas en España, sobre todo con lo que luego se denominará la Gaceta Nueva en Madrid y en Zaragoza. Pero había otros puntos informativos, claramente Barcelona, claramente San Sebastián, claramente también Sevilla, en algunas ocasiones incluso Valencia y Málaga. España en 1621 es una monarquía compuesta. Esto también se ha mencionado. Esto es importante destacar, por varias razones. Primera, porque hay varios reinos, Castilla, Aragón y Portugal, con sus propias leyes, con diferentes corpora legales y por tanto también con diferentes instituciones. Está claro que todo editor de noticias que quisiese tener éxito y continuar con el negocio, con su influencia en el poder y también con poder obtener unos ciertos cuartos de lo que publicaban, de forma manuscrita, privada, semiprivada o pública, impresa, les interesaba tener buena relación con aquellas instituciones. ¿Por qué? Porque sobre todo para el mundo impreso se dependía del sistema de privilegios y licencias. Dependiendo del reino, ¿de acuerdo? Esto funcionaba de una manera o de otra. No había un sistema unificado. Y era un sistema que solo tenía garantizado el éxito allá donde el monarca o la institución de que se tratase podía extender sus dominios, pero no más allá. Eso hacía que más allá de donde actuaba el privilegio de la licencia, en fin, traducir, republicar, adaptar, piratear, incluso fuese un negocio sujeto a pocas limitaciones en origen, ¿de acuerdo? Pero aquí empezamos a ver una manera de regular el negocio de publicar las noticias. Mientras esto se mantiene en el ámbito privado y manuscrito, esto no da demasiados problemas. Cuando esto hay que imprimirlo, entran los poderes públicos y las leyes. Esta es la España de 1621 y los principales focos noticiosos son claramente Sevilla, muy claramente, también porque está mirando hacia América. Madrid, donde no está la corte en estos momentos, se va a trasladar con Felipe IV, claramente Barcelona, en el eje mediterráneo, y aparecen otros. Valencia, del que vamos a tratar, y Lisboa. Recordemos, Felipe IV es también rey de Portugal. Empecemos con Sevilla. Aquí hay algunos nombres que conocemos bien, sobre todo gracias al trabajo de Carmen Espejo y de otros colegas de la Universidad de Sevilla, por tanto no me voy a extender, pero antes de 1621 está la importancia innegable de Rodrigo de Cabrera y luego en estos años la de Juan Serrano de Vargas. Él está intencionadamente muy cercano al Correo Mayor, es decir, al lugar donde llega la afluencia noticiosa. Esto era muy importante. También lo es claramente en el Londres de la época. Y un poquito más tarde llegará Juan de Cabrera. Estos son los tres grandes nombres de este primer tercio, finales del siglo XVI, primer tercio del siglo XVII en Sevilla. En Madrid hay algunos nombres que yo creo que convendría investigar con más detalle, como los de Bernardino de Guzmán, Diego Flamenco o Juan Delgado, que producen algunas noticias. Esto lo he tomado de la exposición, magnífica por cierto, sobre 1621, que se ha puesto en marcha a partir de este coloquio. Otro foco es Barcelona. En Barcelona aparecen sobre todo en esta época, habrá más, pero en esta época se decantan tres nombres. Uno es Esteban Liberós, firmaba, dependiendo de la lengua, de una manera o de otra, cuya actividad conocida va entre 1613 y 1633, por tanto en esta época precisa, y de los hermanos Sebastián y Jaume Matebat, o Sebastián y Jaime Matebat, dependiendo, que van hasta 1641, que es otra época determinante para España y en la que no vamos a entrar, por dos razones: por la guerra del Segadors en Cataluña, que conduce a la breve independencia de Cataluña y la adscripción a la monarquía francesa, y la independencia de Portugal. Vamos a fijarnos en Esteban Liberós. Para empezar, él se asocia, al menos durante 2 años, con otro impresor o editor de noticias, que es Gabriel Graels. En la Corona de Aragón y en Barcelona se distingue muy claramente entre el comercio de los libreros, entre quienes venden, y de los impresores, los que imprimen. Esto va a llegar a tensiones muy claras a final del siglo XVII y solamente se va a resolver con el monopolio que el archiduque Carlos concede a otro impresor un siglo después, que es Rafael de Figueroa. ¿De acuerdo? Pero esto marca una diferencia, por ejemplo, con lo que es Sevilla, donde, que yo sepa, sí se puede editar, publicar, imprimir y vender. Esteban Liberós publica muchísimo, publica, entre otras muchas cosas, impresos noticiosos. Por ejemplo, ¿de acuerdo? Este, que es la reimpresión de una relación de noticias de Sevilla. Y este otro, que es otra relación, 1621, que también no es original de él, sino que es una reimpresión de Sevilla. Aquí conocemos ya algunos nombres. Compuesto por Juan Nión. Es una relación individual, no es un impreso misceláneo, no es una gaceta, todavía. Por tanto, empezamos a ver un poco el perfil de estos editores de noticias. Tienen conexión entre ellos. De alguna manera, él se ha asegurado recibir otros impresos de Sevilla. También los sevillanos se buscan la vida para recibir otros impresos. Por tanto, hay alguna relación de algún tipo entre editores de noticia en España y en Europa. Necesariamente. No actúan jamás en solitario. Y además empezamos a ver que cuando se trata de impresos misceláneos de gacetas, que luego serán semiperiódicas o regulares y después serán claramente periódicas, cuando se trata de noticias individuales, de relaciones, hay más tendencia a dar el nombre de los compiladores. Cuando se trata de periódicos o productos misceláneos, los compiladores, los autores, también se les llama en la época los periodistas, el término es anacrónico, permanecen anónimos, por varias razones, en las que podríamos entrar seguramente en el debate. Y esto se replica también cuando estas noticias se reimprimen y adaptan, por ejemplo, en Inglaterra. Esto es una relación, News from Spain, que se atribuye a Fernando Manojo from the Court, de la corte. Por tanto, se trata de nuevo de perfiles claramente cercanos a los secretarios de los que hablaban Thomas Gainsford o Pánfilo Pérsico. Esteban Liberós tiene relación con Italia, naturalmente, hasta el punto de que no solamente recibe noticias de Italia, sino que los manda de vuelta e imprime en italiano. Como sabe muy bien el profesor Henry Ettinghausen, a quien debemos, entre otras muchas cosas, noticia de esta muy curiosa relación. Vámonos a Valencia. En Valencia se produce, el título es facticio, la Gaceta de Roma. No se la denomina así, salvo en determinados números. Y esto, que sepamos, se reimprime en Valencia entre 1618 y al menos 1620. Hasta el momento conocemos 11 números, ¿de acuerdo? 11 números, pero podría haber seguramente más y no sabemos los que se podrían haber perdido. Esto nos dice que si la publicación no era en Valencia periódica, seguramente tenía una clara regularidad. Esto también se estaba haciendo en el Londres de la época. Se estaba empezando a servir los papeles de noticias con una regularidad semanal. Este es un ejemplo. Aquí vemos que la portada probablemente es diferente en Valencia que en el original en Roma, porque no conocemos el original romano, por lo menos no sabemos si existe, pero no lo conocemos, y normalmente eran 4 páginas. Este es un ejemplo. ¿Qué sabemos de la Gaceta de Roma? Pues que se trataba de relaciones individuales. En realidad es claramente un producto misceláneo, que es una de las características que van a dar lugar al periodismo tal como lo conocemos hoy en día. No son relaciones individuales y, por tanto, parece que hay una cierta tendencia a una cierta periodicidad. Es una colección de noticias semiperiódica, pero muy homogénea, que cubre básicamente la revuelta de Bohemia, es decir, el inicio mismo de la Guerra de los 30 años y otros acontecimientos. y que claramente es la reproducción de un papel noticioso impreso en Roma. El original también era impreso, porque en un momento dado se mencionan grabados que no se reproducen en Valencia y que estaban presentes en la edición en Roma. Y aquí nos encontramos con otro reto metodológico. ¿A dónde nos lleva esto? ¿Qué podemos saber del impresor o del reimpresor, de la persona que publicaba las noticias en Valencia y de la persona que las recopilaba en Roma? Sabemos algunas cosas. El impresor era Francisco Felipe May. Voy a trazar una pequeña genealogía para entenderlo bien. Francisco Felipe May es el hijo de Juan Felipe May, que a su vez es hijo de Johannes o Juan May. Juan May es el primero que se establece en Valencia. Él es de origen flamenco. ¿De acuerdo? De nuevo hay una conexión con Centro Europa. Juan May o Johannes May se casa con Jerónima de Gales y tienen varios hijos. El mayor es Pedro Patricio May, también impresor. Juan Felipe May es más joven. Pedro Patricio se establece en Valencia, es muy longevo, él llega hasta 1623 y Juan Felipe May se tiene que ir a Tarragona, por tanto, a Cataluña, donde se casa con Ana Llagostera, que es la hija de un notario. Por tanto, empieza a tener relación con secretarios. Además de impresor, él es un humanista, él habla griego y latín, y cuando vuelve a Valencia, en 1587, se establece como impresor y como profesor de la universidad. Esto es importante. Era un hombre culto. Y sus hijos, uno de ellos, Francisco Felipe May, también lo eran. Francisco Felipe hereda la imprenta de su padre en 1612 y es activo hasta 1626. Pero tiene que competir con su tío. Por tanto, ¿qué ocurre? Que Francisco Felipe May compite con su propia familia. Esto es muy típico de la época. Y entonces tiene que competir también por la protección y por asegurarse las órdenes de las instituciones locales, ayuntamientos, diputaciones, universidades, iglesia, que les aseguraba poder mantenerse. Cuando no tienen esto o no se lo aseguran, Felipe May no lo tenía tan asegurado como su tío, es muy típico que decidan complementar la edición más laboriosa de obras mayores, de libros, con otro tipo de impresos menores. Por ejemplo, oraciones. ¿De acuerdo? Y también con noticias. Y es en este momento cuando ven que aquí hay una salida comercial a su actividad. Porque las noticias son más rápidas, porque se aseguran un mercado ávido de noticias que quiere que regularmente sean abastecidos y porque además son productos mucho más fáciles de imprimir, mucho más efímeros. Se imprime generalmente una plancha y se dobla y se vende y por tanto decide invertir en el negocio informativos y reimprimir una publicación de Roma. Se trata de noticias que no se compilan en Valencia sino en Roma, por tanto solamente es una reimpresión. Quizá las portadas sí están diseñadas para un público local, para atraer la compra en Valencia. Esto sabemos que era así en Sevilla, por ejemplo, probablemente también en Barcelona. No hay ni una sola noticia que se añada en Valencia, por tanto solamente se traducen, en algunos casos muy literalmente, y esto es importante, cuentan con permiso oficial en Valencia, del abogado fiscal encargado de la imprenta en Valencia. Por tanto, están cubiertos por las instituciones. Por contra, ¿qué sabemos del autor de las noticias, del compilador, del original de Roma? No sabemos el nombre, sí conocemos sus características. Por tanto, estamos en el terreno de los indicios tentativos. Probablemente era una sola mano, no hay ninguna automención, nunca, el autor es desconocido, pero claramente era un recolector de noticias, con un estilo muy determinado. Un secretario, en todo caso, estaba muy bien conectado con fuentes oficiales, claramente el Vaticano y en concreto el Sacro Colegio Cardenalicio y con la diplomacia vaticana y española. Por tanto, aquí tenemos de nuevo ese perfil del que nos hablaba el profesor Jung al inicio de este seminario. Yo estoy seguro de que era un secretario, de ese tipo de perfil que describen Gainsford y, para su ámbito de actuación, Pánfilo Pérsico. Y además estaba muy bien conectado con otros muchos lugares de Europa. Hemos sido capaces de reconstruir de dónde vienen las noticias, mayoritariamente, claro está, de Roma y de Italia, pero también de otros puntos. Tanto en el libro del que le hemos hablado como de este último capítulo que he publicado, tienen esas tablas y podrán apreciar cuál era la red informativa de ese secretario romano. Y además utilizaba una amplia variedad de fuentes, porque las menciona por avisos de Roma, por correspondencia particular, etcétera, etcétera. De nuevo, intentando dar credibilidad y confianza. Vemos aquí que la mayor parte de las fuentes son avisos, es decir, otros productos noticiosos publicados, manuscritos o impresos seguramente en otros lugares de Europa. Y no es de desdeñar el uso que hace de fuentes oficiales, claramente. Vemos aquí otra representación de esas fuentes de que dispone ese secretario romano, ¿de acuerdo? Por tanto, ese anónimo compilador o autor o editor o periodista, si queremos, secretario en Roma, estaba tejiendo una serie de redes que nos habla de la importancia de los diplomáticos, de los nobles y de las nobles, se citan bastantes mujeres, de personajes de renombre religioso y militar en una sociedad como la europea, con una creciente movilidad. Y esto, por tanto, es consistente con el panorama que nos describían las anteriores intervenciones. Bastantes de esos personajes de los que nos hablan los 11 números de la Gaceta de Roma aparecen en este cuadro, que es de Bartolomeo Strobel el Joven. Está este cuadro del Museo del Prado y hay otro en una pinacoteca alemana en Múnich, ¿de acuerdo? Y buena parte de los diplomáticos, reyes, militares, cargos eclesiásticos de los que nos habla esa Gaceta de Roma tienen cara. Solo ellos tienen cara, Felipe Mey no tiene cara y el compilador secretario romano no tiene cara ni nombre. Y esto es importante también destacarlo. Finalmente, y voy concluyendo, ¿qué sabemos de la actividad noticiosa alrededor de 1621? Primero, y esto es obvio y evidente, que la Guerra de los 30 años dio el salto definitivo a abastecer, a saciar el hambre o la avidez de noticias. Que empiezan a definirse, esto viene de antes, pero empiezan a definirse una variedad de oficios y profesiones alrededor de ese negocio. Que invertir en las noticias empieza a ser una oportunidad para impresores menores, para editores, para poder entrar en la competición. Y son personas que empiezan a representar no tanto a la nobleza, aunque están en buena relación con la nobleza, cuanto a la burguesía comercial que nos describe Ben Jones. Para el primer periodismo español, el término es anacrónico, el modelo es claramente italiano. Es el modelo de Pánfilo Pérsico y es el modelo de los primeros impresos, avisos impresos misceláneos italianos. La principal actividad, y lo va a continuar siendo, es la compilación profesional de noticias, ¿de acuerdo? Es decir, la parte a la que ponemos menos cara, la parte más anónima. Y empieza a decantarse sobre todo la importancia de los paquetes misceláneos de noticias servidos regularmente a los clientes. Esto lo describe perfectamente Ben Jones en The Staple of News, en el comercio de noticias. Y esto va a dar lugar a los periódicos, a las gacetas, como las denominamos en España. Gacetas entendidas como periódicos generalmente semanales, conteniendo una pluralidad de noticias en estilo muy breve y seco, ordenadas cronológicamente o por procedencia geográfica, servidas por un precio determinado a los clientes finales. Y cuanto más popular es el consumo de noticias, esto se debe sobre todo a la imprenta, aunque se mantiene el comercio claramente privado, semiprivado, público, semipúblico de noticias también manuscritas. Y esto va a ser así durante bastante tiempo. Permítanme una coda muy rápida. En 1621 también, puede parecer una anécdota, pero seguramente no lo es, nace en Borgoña François Fabre Bremondan. Mi francés es peor que mi inglés. Se le conoce en España por Francisco Fabro Bremondan. Es el secretario, de nuevo, de Juan de Austria. Es el creador de lo que luego se llamará la Gaceta Nueva. Al principio tiene títulos diversos, por tanto no es un periódico al principio, es una publicación miscelánea regular, pero no es un periódico, en 1661. Y él obtiene, gracias a Juan de Austria, el cargo de Gacetero Mayor de España. Muere en 1698, prácticamente cuando acaba la dinastía de los Autres, y por tanto a las puertas de la Guerra de Sucesión, que es una guerra española, pero con alcance europeo, y que va a dar lugar claramente a otra época también en el mercado informativo. Pero esto es otra historia. Creo que me he ceñido absolutamente a la hora que me han muy generosamente concedido, y simplemente les agradezco su atención y quedo naturalmente a todas las preguntas o comentarios que quieran hacerme, y desde luego al coloquio que espero podamos mantener en inglés con el profesor Paul Albaster. Muchísimas gracias, espero que me hayan visto y oído bien. Yo estoy un poco a oscuras y no les veo a ustedes. Gracias.
Muchas gracias, Javier Díaz Nozzi, por la excelente conferencia. Fantásticas conclusiones que sin duda... vale. Pues hacemos una pausa de 5 minutitos para reiniciar, ¿o no? O en el chat. Yo creo que es lo mejor en el chat.
Hola.
¿Nos oyes, Javier?
¿Siguen ahí?
Pues, si le ponéis en el chat.
Ahora les oigo.
¿Sí? ¿Nos oyes?
¿Hola? ¿Nos escucha?
Hola, ahora es cuando se ve y se oye bien. ¿Se me ha oído, se me ha visto bien?
Sí, se ha visto perfecto. Un segundito, por favor.
Vale.
Se ha visto, se ha escuchado perfectamente. ¿Sí?
Sí, vale.
Nada.
¿Cómo hacemos ahora?
Decía, Javier, que muchísimas gracias. No sé si me has escuchado, por la excelente conferencia.
Sí, gracias, ahora oigo.
Las conclusiones han sido, bueno, todo interesantísimo, y estoy segura de que van a sugerir alguna pregunta, algún comentario. Entonces abrimos un turno pequeño. Gracias también por ajustarse también al tiempo. Abrimos un pequeñito turno de preguntas. Ya hay una mano levantada. Paola Molino, por favor.
No podemos ponerle la cámara grande, estamos teniendo problemas, ¿vale?
Salvo que ven aquí.
Pero para las preguntas, si nos puede escuchar, sí que se pueden ir respondiendo.
Escucho bien, sí. I hear it. Paola, if you want to speak in Italian or English,
yeah,
I can understand Italian as well.
Yeah,
Probably my Italian is even
English
weaker than my English, I'm afraid.
It's fine. I can speak in English. So thank you for your presentation. It was very interesting, I think, to think of how also this news from Rome then were remediated in Spain. And I was thinking while listening to you, two things. The first is that the Gazzetta di Roma, the printed gazette from Rome, this had been already printed since the middle of the 16th century, but this is not a very famous chapter of the information history of Rome, because the handwritten newsletter was much more famous. But there is an old book, I can send also Carmen the reference. It's about the printed gazette, because Rome was one of the first cities in which they have started to print a gazette. Only, of course, it was not so regular like the handwritten one. But there is a, let's say, also lot of influences between the handwritten and the printed one. For instance, Rome is a city that had also the single gazette from Rome, handwritten. So La Gazzetta di Roma is a single newsletter produced there. So I think that the tradition of the Gazzetta di Roma that is then retaken in the Spanish case is a very long one, and it doesn't surprise me that, that they exported, let's say, this product, because the market was very wide. So there was a huge production of Gazzette di Roma. Some of them were printed and some other not. But so I would maybe encourage you to look in this direction. And then the other question, this is really a question, is what you would like to find when you speak about the news writers in terms of makers of the news. Because you say that we don't have so many information about them. As a matter of fact, for Italy, let's say Venice, but also like for Cologne, also, we have some information about them. We know, for instance, how they fabricated the news, and how much the subscription were paid, a little bit how was the work divided in the workshop. But I had the impression that you were looking for something different. So what would you like to know then? What would you like to find out about these news writers?
Okay, thank you so much. I appreciate, I think there is a little bit feedback. I can hear my voice as an echo. Thank you. Yeah, both Carmen Espejo and Rafael Soto and myself were searching, we were asking ourselves to which extent that printed and or handwritten Gazette from Rome, Gazzetta di Roma, or Gazzette in plural di Roma may appear. So we would really appreciate very much if you could handle us those references and even whether it was possible to access those handwritten and printed gazettes. So we can reconsider all the time, and that's a challenge of our investigation, of our research, our points of view. And it underlines as well the importance of such seminars and events, so to put in contact, to put in touch different scholars all over the world and Europe, because new things and new ways are discovered. So thank you very much again indeed. Regarding the second question, it's related, in my case at least, with my formation. I teach journalism at the university, so I'm interested in journalists and the history of journalism, understood as the history of journalists. Censurato, I mean in a wide sense, about who were the people who produced, wrote, or consumed the news, actually. What do we know? I mean, we know the names of the people Gazette and newsletter dealt with. I mean, the important people, military people, mandatories, kings, generals, the Pope, and so on. But we know very little about the printers, quite little about the editors, and very few about the authors. I mean, the people that was hired, like Crestus in Rome, to specifically write down the news. I mean, the people who compiled, gathered the news, then arranged the news, translate the news, adapted the news, and wrote the news, and finally served the news. We found a reference much later in a Spanish language gazette published in Brussels, actually in 80 something, telling the authors, literally the author of the news is unable to serve you weekly as I usually do because the post hasn't arrived this week, and because I'm very busy trying to write some book and trying to lengthen my wages, actually. But there are very, very few references even less auto-references to the job of so-called later journalists. So that's the part I'm interested in, but also in not focusing only in printers. Probably the historiography of journalism in Spain has focused too much on printers, who by no means was the most important figure in the beginning of Spanish journalists at all. I mean, Bremundan wasn't a printer. Many others weren't printers at all, were publishers, actually. The printers were other. And at the end of the 17th century, that differentiation of both jobs, the printers and the publishers and the editor and the real authors became more apparent. I don't know if that answered your questions and whether my English is understandable. I'm so sorry about that.
Yes, I understood. And I think that you're right. There are actually a few traces of exactly what you were searching in the collection of the handwritten news. So I think that you're right that it's something that one can detect only with the little spots when they write, and it happens much more in the 16th and then later in the 17th century. If you look, for instance, at this collection of the brothers Fugger, the newsletters from 50s, 60s, 50s, 70s, they contain much more of this intervention of what you would call a journalist of the time than in the time that you consider, so the beginning of the 17th century. But I think that in the Fugger Zeitung that are digitalized, there you can find a lot. So if you are curious, especially regarding the rise of the profession, how do they feel, for instance, the feeling of being under time pressure, because the next boat has to come, or for instance, the conjecture about of whether a news is reliable or not, a decision that they take of whether to forward the news or not. This is something that can be found there, yeah.
Yeah, that's great, and once again, I appreciate very, very much, Paola, very, very much, because yeah, we are looking for that. There are traces, for example, when Ben Jonson describes the factor of news in the Masquerade in 1620, he refers to that pressure as well. I write my 100 letters a week, 100 letters. Probably we write more emails than that. But my feeling, at least in the Spanish case, is that letters, individual letters, I mean, individual news had authors, I mean, had names, but miscellaneous collections hadn't. Probably also for legal reasons. It was easier to try to avoid legal consequences, especially criminal ones. Some people in Rome lost his tongue and his hands because of sharing his name with people. So they tended to be an anonymous or, well, a job with no name after that. Names appear, especially in the 18th century and before, you're right, in the 16th century and later on in the 19th century. But the 16th century periodical newspapers are quite anonymous except for the printer, actually. That's probably one of the reasons why we tend to focus on the printers, even though if they are not the only agent of news, and many times not the most important one, definitely.
Sí, hola. La pregunta era también sobre la Gaceta de Roma, cuya edición que han dirigido, que me parece soberbia, he manejado, y hablo siendo más o menos historiador político y a lo mejor metiéndome en terreno pantanoso, pero hay dos cuestiones que me parecen muy interesantes. La primera es que me da la impresión de que son noticias cortadas para el mercado peninsular, o sea, que no son los avisos generales o todos los que se reciben en Roma, sino los que pueden interesar en Valencia o en España, de noticias del turco, de la guerra en Centro Europa, pero hablando de cuántas tropas manda el duque de Osuna, cuánto socorro envía el rey, eso lo primero. Y lo segundo, que, y aquí quizá aventure de más, hay algunas cuestiones que, por lo que yo he visto de correspondencias oficiales, sobre todo del Colegio Cardenalicio de Vida de Roma, son más o menos vox populi y cualquier bien informado en Roma lo puede saber, pero cuestiones de correos internos de la monarquía, esto de el virrey de Nápoles ha escrito al gobernador de Milán esto y ha pasado por aquí el correo, eso es una carta que ha recibido también el embajador en Roma. O sea, me hace pensar que sea alguien vinculado a la embajada, de la secretaría de la embajada, y no sé si por ahí, y además bastante usunista y anti-Borja. Y ya por ahí podríamos discutir mucho. Muchas gracias.
Gracias por la pregunta. Sí, probablemente hemos dejado esto para posterior ocasión, es decir, analizar el contenido propio de las noticias que conocemos que se reimprimen en Valencia. Sin el original romano tampoco podemos saber si se han expurgado noticias, ni cuáles, ni aventurar el porqué. Esto sabemos que pasa más tarde también, es bastante habitual. También por otra razón, porque las noticias eran de ida y vuelta, es decir, noticias de España que van a Italia y después vuelven, están muy caducas, ¿de acuerdo? Y sí, el perfil responde al que ha expresado usted. Es alguien, probablemente una mano única, porque el estilo es muy homogéneo, incluso con la traducción, a veces yo creo que apresurada, se dejan italianismos muy claros. Es una mano única, es alguien cercano a los círculos del poder, a los círculos diplomáticos, pero también claramente cercano, yo creo, al Sacro Colegio Cardinalicio. También porque insiste mucho en noticias acerca de ese colegio. También significativamente, yo creo que en Valencia, yo no sé qué es lo que se expurga, a ver si con la información que nos manda Paola Molino podemos ir más lejos, pero si se expurga algo y se mantiene algo en Valencia de lo que se publica en Roma, yo creo que se mantiene todo lo que se refiere a los avances militares en los primeros momentos de la Guerra de los 30 años. Con algunos lugares, por cierto, de dudosa atribución, porque lugares muy pequeños, cuyo nombre ha cambiado y al traducir y retraducir a veces son un poco tentativos. Ha sido una labor, Carmen Espejo lo sabe muy bien, en algunas ocasiones de chinos. Perdone, muy laboriosa, quiero decir.
Muchas gracias. ¿Alguna pregunta más rapidita? ¿No? Pues entonces damos paso, muchísimas gracias Javier y enhorabuena, damos paso por lo tanto a la siguiente ponencia. Y llamo por lo tanto a la mesa a Paul Laster.
I have something for those present. I don't know if there, who would be able to hand them out. Can I give them to you?
Thank you. ¿Podéis repartir, por favor? Creo que lo dejamos para al final, si no le importa.
Sent the PowerPoint beforehand. Where will that be?
No, no problem. This was a very small comment. I can do it then. I would prefer to go to Professor Buster now. Thank you.
Comienzo, por lo tanto, la presentación. Paul Laster es doctor por la Universidad de Oxford, ha sido profesor en las universidades de Leiden, Lovaina y Maastricht y actualmente imparte docencia en la Facultad de Traducción e Interpretación en la Universidad de San Luis de Bruselas. Formó parte del equipo de investigación del proyecto News Networks in Early Modern Europe, dirigido por Johan Raymond. Su investigación está centrada en la historia de los Países Bajos, particularmente las conexiones culturales de este territorio con otros como la monarquía hispánica. Es autor de numerosísimas obras de referencia, como el libro sobre la Guerra de los 30 años, y nos va a hablar del impresor Abraham, lo pronunciaré muy mal, no, él nos lo dirá mejor, Merueben. Y le doy la palabra. Muchísimas gracias.
Is there some way of... Yes, but but I have to share the screen as well, don't I? For those online. That one. Is that the one? PowerPoint. It doesn't seem to find it. What does that mean? There we go. Fantastic. Will that work? What's it trying to do now? There we go. Okay. Why is it? Oh, that one. That one not do that. How's that? Can those of you following online see that? Yes? Okay, great. So, Abraham Verhoeven, with an U in the middle, Verhoeven, and the news of 1621. On these three pamphlets that you can see on the screen, I hope everybody can see them on the screen, each contain news from a different part of Europe. All of them were printed by Abraham Verhoeven on the 8th of January 1621. Diverse Tidings from Vienna in Austria is the title of one. Short Narrative of What is Now Happening in Prague is the title of the other. The first one, it's called Diverse Tidings from Vienna in Austria. There are 4 different letters from Vienna in that publication. The second one, The Short Narrative of What's Now Happening in Prague. There are 2 different letters from Prague in that, and 3 letters from other places in Bohemia, smaller Bohemian towns. And the third one, Tidings from the River Rhine, contains a letter from Frankfurt and a letter from Cologne, and news from the winter quarters of the Spanish army in the Palatinate. All of them you could, taken individually, mistake for the typical news pamphlet that had been published for a century by then. Each of them is an 8-page booklet, a single sheet of paper, printed and folded twice to make a little pamphlet. But in actual fact, there's one tiny detail that sets them apart, which is they have a serial number. So each of them is part of a series. Verhoeven began serial publication in 1620, but he only added a serial number to the front page of each issue at the beginning of 1621. So these are the first regularly numbered serial news publications in Antwerp. The series itself had no uniform title. Librarians and bibliographers have had to find one for it. In the British Library, the run that they have there is catalogued as Gazette of Antwerp. But in the Low Countries, the series is usually known as the Nieuwe Tijdingen, the New Tidings, from 2 words that occur in many of the front page headlines, but not by any means in all the front page headlines. new tidings from Italy and Rome you have there, new tidings from Prague in Bohemia and from the River Rhine, and new tidings from Spain. So that neue Tädinger that often recurs in the headlines has become, for cataloguers, bibliographers, librarians, the fictional title of the series that has no fixed title. But the choice in the British Library to go with Gazette also has good grounds. Once or twice a month, Verhoeven would print a roundup of news from all over Europe, and he would call that Gazette Universelle. He only did that in 1621. He stopped doing it after 1621, I think because it was just too complicated to divide the news up thematically, week by week, and say, this is news from Germany, this is news from Austria, this is news from Italy. And then once a month say, this is news from all over the place, but it's much easier just to go with the flow of the news. So the Nieuwe Tädingen or the Gazette. Before I go any further, I would like to say that the material I've shown you so far, the visual material, and most of the visual material that I will show you comes from the Hendrik Conscience Heritage Library in Antwerp, who digitized. Yes?
We have not seen this internet.
What's the problem?
In internet, one cannot see.
Oh, right. Okay.
Es la flechita.
Sí.
That should be it.
A ver si ahora.
Yeah.
Bueno. A ver, ahora sí. Ahora sí.
Yeah.
Okay.
Gracias. Is that okay? Right, okay. Some of the material actually doesn't come from there. I will be showing you some images from the Rijksmuseum website, some images from Ghent University Library and from the National Library of the Netherlands, or is it the Royal Library? I think they changed the name. I think it's called the National Library of the Netherlands now in The Hague, both of which made them available through Google Books, and also from the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, available through Gallica. But most of the material comes from the Hendrik Conscience Heritage Library, who have scanned their holdings of the Nieuwe Tädingen and made them available online under a Creative Commons license, which is fantastic. And with the pandemic, it's wonderful that all this stuff is available online. So a typical front page of an issue of the Nieuwe Tädingen combines elements that would have been familiar from old-fashioned news pamphlets, Relaciones de Sucesos, if I pronounce that anywhere like correctly. There's a title at the top, there's an image in the middle, and there's the printer's name and address at the bottom. It combines this with elements that you would not see on that other style of publication, giving the date and a serial number, often, well, always the month, and usually also the precise day of publication, which you would not see on the traditional news pamphlets. Something else that you often see on the title pages, and I'm very grateful to Carmen for drawing attention to it earlier today, is information that this is translated and saying which language it's translated from. So in this particular instance, it's translated from German, it says. There are also instances where it says from Italian, from French, from Spanish, from Latin, and in one case from Polish. So you can actually see what languages they're working from, and something that I actually want to do, but it's at the stage of thinking about putting together an application to get money to do it, is to look at these as translations. Since the beginning of July, I've been posting summaries of these on Facebook, some of you may have seen. Within a week of me starting to do that, I set up a page on Facebook and started posting English summaries of the Nieuwe Tädingen. The Facebook business support team the world experts in getting people's attention and keeping it, got in touch with me to say, I think it's fully automated. I don't think anybody there was looking at it. I got a message from the Facebook business support team saying that the most effective posts have a recognizable image with short, clear text. And this is precisely what Abraham Verhoeven was offering when you compare what he was printing with the typical news publication in Amsterdam at the time, which follows that, to a T, follows that dry style. Visually, it's very unappealing. It's just two dense columns of text printed on either side of a piece of paper, whereas Abraham Verhoeven was giving a picture with a short text on the front, just as Facebook would advise. So from that point of view, what he's doing was novel in the context of news publication in the Low Countries at the time. The contents, however, were not that different from what was being published in other newspapers, in German Zeitungen, in Dutch Couranten, in what would soon come to be called Courantos in English. I think this is the one I've given you a little copy of. Those of you who are in the room, you have, did you receive the handout? Yes? No, they're here. They haven't been handed out. So you will receive this handout in just a moment, so you can follow along in your own copy. In real life, they would have been slightly bigger than this. Not quite twice as big, but closer to twice as big. But those of you at home or wherever you happen to be online can also follow on the screen. So this particular issue, number 164, published on the 12th of November, 1621, it has news from the Spanish army in the Palatinate near Stein, sent on the 29th of October, 1621, which is actually quite bad news. I've heard it, I've seen writers claim that Abraham Verhoeven doesn't publish bad news. That's not true. He's perfectly willing to publish bad news. He just won't tell you that it's bad news, and he won't put it on the front page. So you actually have to be paying attention to see that it's bad news. The second story is one from Warsaw about the Battle of Khotyn that we heard so much about in the Besançon wing of the conference. And the third one is a story from Seville, sent on the 20th of October, which is about the West Indies fleet arriving and about Don Federico de Toledo having his fleet ready at the Strait of Gibraltar to prevent the passage of the Dutch, and that Don Rodrigo Calderón has finally been executed, it says. Obviously a sense that things were taking rather a long time there. So it contains the sorts of stories that you find in regular newspapers. Often a letter will contain news from lots of different places, as we've already heard today in various contexts. This is an example, a letter from Venice, Venice marked in red, with news from Genoa. They've got a letter from Genoa that says something. They've got a letter from Milan that says something. They've got letters from Syria, that should say, although for some reason it says Soria, with news from, Alexandria, and news from Switzerland as well there. So you have the letter from Venice, and it contains these reports, bulletins, that Carmen said. The language with which we talk about this is still too vague. We have to find ways of categorizing it to talk about it more accurately. So you can break it down like this. I've color-coded it. The letter printed in the Neue Tijden from Venice in red, with news from Genoa, Genoa in blue. It's about things that are happening in Savona and in Cartagena. So those are in yellow. News from Milan, again, the news comes from Milan, that's in blue. The news from Syria, Syria in blue, but it's about something that's happened in Alexandria, so Alexandria is in yellow. The news from Chur in Switzerland is about something that's happened not actually in Chur, but between Lindau and the Grisons. And then if you map this, which I've done, you can see the red dots are where the news comes to Antwerp from. The blue and the green dots are then secondary sources of news. So if the letter from Venice, the news it contains from Genoa, that will be marked in blue or green, and then the place that the news is happening in is marked in yellow. So Cartagena is marked in yellow because that's where something's happening that's being reported from Genoa in a letter to Venice that's being printed in Antwerp. I'm not going to say anything more about this now. I've provided you with a link. You can take a quick shot of that or screenshot it. And we can talk about it afterwards if you have questions about it, but I'm going to move on now to other matters, because this isn't the only way of visualizing the data or the metadata from the Nieuwe Tijdingen. In 1621, Abraham Verhoeven, between the 8th of January and the 24th of December, so between Epiphany and Christmas, he printed at least 195 issues, going up to number 192, and 179 of them have the precise date of publication. Not all of them do. As you can see here from number 10, that just says printed in January. It doesn't give the day. So I'm not sure why that is. Sometimes he doesn't give the day, but usually he gives the day. You can also see that the pictures are not unique. It's not a new image for each edition. He has a whole stock of woodcuts, and he'll use one that looks sort of relevant to the news he wants to draw attention to. Almost visual cliches. So the same battles, the same sieges, the same commanders come back again and again and again, depicting different news. The reason that the numbers only go up to 192 is that on 3 occasions he accidentally reused a number. So there are 2 different issues numbered 122, there are 2 different issues numbered 103, and there are 2 different issues numbered 64, I think it is, although I don't have pictures of those. So I guess that's because it's very busy and there's time pressure, so you don't always get it right, and sometimes a number gets reused when it shouldn't. Over the course of the year, he's printing not as they were in Amsterdam, once a week, or in the German Zeitungen, once a week, so at the end of the year you have 52 issues, but he's printing between 2 and 7 issues each week. And on average, 3.8 issues each week. What was I going to say? Oh, so he's printing news every week, but not necessarily to a very fixed pattern. These are the days on which he prints. Those dated issues, you can see what day they're printed on. So usually he's printing on Fridays, and he prints on all but 6 Fridays of the year, 1621. One of those Fridays is New Year's Day, so obviously you're not going to print one then. One of those Fridays is Good Friday, so obviously you're not going to print one then. One of those Fridays is the Feast of the Visitation, which is a big feast in Antwerp, so obviously you're not going to print then. But that does leave 3 Fridays where he doesn't print an issue, and I'm not sure why. But that's a relatively minor failure in periodicity. I mean, he's printing almost every Friday, he's printing news, and if he's not printing news on a Friday, then he'll print it on the Saturday, or he'll print it on the Thursday. And very often he's also printing news on a Wednesday, or sometimes on a Monday or a Tuesday. But Friday's the main day of publication. The main market day in Antwerp was Saturday. So anybody who went to Antwerp on a Saturday for the market and wanted to see what news there was that week and went to Abraham Verhoeven's shop, the only Saturday in the year when they would not have news from that week to buy was the 2nd of January. So every other Saturday through the year, you go in, is there any news this week? Yes. Whether it's printed on Wednesday or Friday or Thursday, there's at least 2 issues. In one week, as many as 7. It's a very flexible pattern of publication. It's a very hybrid sort of publication. It looks a bit like a pamphlet, but then it contains what you'd expect in a newspaper. It's sort of weekly, but not very rigorously printed on one particular day. So it is, I mean, it's flexible, it's hybrid. Some people have said it doesn't count as a newspaper because it doesn't strictly meet criteria of periodicity, and it doesn't have a fixed title. And I'm not sure, I mean, maybe it doesn't then count strictly as a newspaper, but it counts as something. It's some sort of periodical news publication, whatever name you choose to stick on it. The pattern of production, you know, the days that there was no issue, the days that there were multiple issues, the days when he was printing a little bit beforehand and then more afterwards to work around a feast day, those reflect the employment practices and the local culture of the city of Antwerp, when the market days are, when the holidays are, when the public celebrations are. Abraham Verhoeven himself was born in Antwerp. You have the highlights, or at least the main, some of them are perhaps more low points, but you have the main dates of his career on the back of the handout there. Born in Antwerp in 1575, received into the Catholic Church in 1589. From our point of view, most importantly, in 1604, he joined the Guild of St. Luke as a printmaker, and he married a printmaker's daughter. And in 1605, with his wife's bridal portion, he opened a shop, the Golden Sun, and got a license to print news. And the Golden Sun was a little shop in a little street in Antwerp, 2 blocks south of the cathedral, in a part of the city where there were a lot of small businesses in the printing and the arts trades and luxury crafts. So it's not, you know, these are all people who work for rich people, who produce luxuries of one sort or another. And this is the context in which the news is being produced. There is not a trace left of the original building, but the building that is there now has set in stone on front of it Abraham Verhoeven, the first newspaper man in the world, 1605. And that date, that 1605, reflects the widespread, or well, the popularity in Antwerp certainly, of the misunderstanding that he began printing a newspaper in 1605. When he got a license to print news in 1605, the sorts of thing he was printing was this. Their copperplate engravings, news prints, which show some big event, and he produces a few of these a year. They're not something that you can do, they're not something you can produce on a weekly basis, I wouldn't imagine, although I don't really know much about the production of prints. This is the very first one that he produces, as far as we know, about an event that took place just outside Antwerp on the 17th of May, 1605. It's dedicated to Don Inigo de Boya, who was the commander of the Spanish garrison in the citadel in Antwerp. I've zoomed in a bit on a different copy here, which has higher resolution, so you can see the quality of the work. You can see the Dutch yachts putting troops aboard on the far bank. You can see Dutch warships and fireships trying to impede intervention from the Antwerp side. You can see little boats putting across the Spanish soldiers where they're landing to repulse the Dutch invaders. There's a neutral English ship sort of got caught up in the middle of it, and the peasants driving their livestock away from the front line. So you know, the level of detail is fantastic, the quality of the print is fantastic, and this is what Abraham Verhoeven began his career as a news publisher producing, nothing like a newspaper. The hero of that first publication is Don Inigo de Boya, but the hero of almost everything else that Verhoeven goes on to produce is Ambrogio Spinola. This is a print from 1606 from the siege of Grol or Groenlo in the eastern Netherlands. And down in the bottom left-hand corner, you can see, picked out by name, tiny image of Spinola surrounded by his personal guard directing the operations of the siege. You can also see right down in the bottom corner Abraham Verhoeven's own name. And incidentally, the third name here, it says signed by Bucherer. I assumed, stupidly, why would one assume anything? I assumed when I first saw this that that meant that Bucherer was the artist who'd produced the print, because, you know, why else would Bucherer have signed it? What it actually means is that the license for publication was signed by Joachim de Bucherer, who was a secretary to the Council of Brabant. And just to make a quick oral contribution to the debate between manuscript and print that Paula referred to this morning, if you have my book about the early newspaper press in what's now Belgium, you can make that correction yourself on page 63. That signed by Buscherer means that he was the licensing secretary who signed the license. When he prints the Nieuwe Tijdingen, Abraham Verhoeven continues to glorify the achievements of Ambrogio Spinola as a diplomat and as a general, especially as a general. It's not all Spinola all the time, but it's certainly a lot of Spinola a lot of the time in the Nieuwe Tijdingen. And this continues through to the end of Spinola's presence in the Low Countries and in effect to the end of Verhoeven's career. It reaches a high point, though, in 1621, which surprised me a little. You'd have thought that 1625, with the surrender of Breda, would be the moment to celebrate Spinola. But actually, in 1621, when he returns from Germany, from his victories in the Palatinate, he returns to the Low Countries to resume command of the army of Flanders, and that's when his heroic deeds and heroic figure are most celebrated. This particular image is an allegorical image in which Spinola, marked O, is the chivalrous knight who's rescuing the lion of the Low Countries, Leo Belgicus, who's in the middle, who's been tied down at the mercy of Dutch predators, who you can see the Dutch predators running away there when they see Spinola coming. So this is an allegorical image that conveys the good that can be expected from him coming to the Low Countries to lead the armies against the Dutch. And there's more going on in the background. You have a fleet going, or at least a ship, sailing to the Indies, and you have the Emperor flanked by Justice and Peace, and there's all sorts of other things going on. But the central focus is Spinola's rescuing the lion of the Low Countries from the horrible Dutch. There's also this poster, so hardcore fans of the general can put his likeness up in their home or their workplace. Again, printed by Verhoeven in Antwerp in 1621 to celebrate Spinola's achievements. And there's even a little biography of Spinola written in Latin and then translated into Dutch, and the Dutch translation is issued as a number of the Nieuwe Tijdingen, number 67. That you can see there's a typo, the B and the R in Ambrosius have been transposed, which is not that unusual a typographical mistake, but it's a bit unfortunate, I suppose, for Spinola to have his name garbled like that by people who were making such a fuss about him. That Latin biography, which is published without an author's name, has been attributed to Albertus Mirreus, whom you can see here in an engraving from a portrait by Anthony van Dyck. Albertus Mirreus, it says Decanus Antwerpiensis there. He wasn't yet in 1621 the Dean of Antwerp. In 1624 he became the Dean of Antwerp. In 1621 he was the court librarian of the Archdukes Albert and Isabella in Brussels. And court librarians, they're key figures, at least in some of the circulation, perhaps not so much the circulation of news, but certainly the circulation of propaganda, both in German principalities and in the Low Countries. You can see that that's one of the things that a court librarian is expected to be involved in. In October 1620, there's a letter from Mirreus to Gasper Gewatius, or Caspar Gevaerts, who becomes in 1621 the secretary of Antwerp City Council, who you can also see there in a portrait, in an engraving after a portrait by Van Dyck, asking him, Gewatius, to try to get Verhoeven to print some material that Mirreus has sent about what's happening in Switzerland, where there's been the revolt in the Valterline, where the Catholic population have risen up against their Protestant rulers and have called upon the governor of Milan to protect them from the horrible Protestants. And the governor of Milan is doing that, and the Spanish court maybe thinks they have enough going on without adding to the list of things that they're getting involved in. But the governor of Milan is very, But anyway, that's the whole story. I needn't go into that right now. But the Grisonse Historie des Jahres 1620, that publication, it's anonymous. It doesn't have Verhoeven's name on it. It doesn't have an author's name on it. But probably that's what Mirreus is writing to Gewatius about. Then in 1621 we have his Latin biography of Spinola, which is also turned into Dutch in the Nieuwe Tijdingen. Also in 1621 we have a short Latin biography of Philip III, which is turned into Dutch and printed as an issue of the Nieuwe Tijdingen, and you can see penciled at the top there by a librarian, Mireus, as the attribution of this Latin text. There's also in 1620, and you can see there penned in a 17th century hand, so it's a contemporary attribution. There's the Belli Bohemici Origo Progressus et Finis, or Ac Finis, which is a short, very short, potted history of the Bohemian Revolt, written in Latin, published by Verhoeven. Then the next year, published by Verhoeven in French translation, and also published by Verhoeven in Dutch translation, but the Dutch translation is an issue of the Nieuwe Tijdingen. It's number 69 in the series. The original copy goes up, the original Latin version, I'm already thinking of the next slide, but there's something I haven't told you about this one yet. The original Latin text is published in 1621 and goes up to the Battle of the White Mountain, the imperial triumph outside Prague. The Dutch text in 1690 adds on a little bit after that and takes the story up to the 12th of April, I think it is, when Spinola negotiates the surrender, well, surrender is perhaps too big a word for it. Spinola negotiates the disbanding of the armies of the Protestant Union in Germany in April 1621, which is widely perceived at the time, in that moment, to be the end of the 30 Years' War. It only took 3 years. And then the Protestant Union disband their armies. It's fantastic. It's all over already. And Spinola is one of the people responsible for that triumph. One of Verhoeven's other innovations is advertising. He cross-advertises his publications. So at the end of 69, it says, and then on the 12th of April, Marquis Spinola negotiated a treaty with the princes of the Protestant Union that they would disband their armies. And the text of this treaty is available in various languages from Abraham Verhoeven in Antwerp. So in the Nieuwe Tijdingen, he's advertising for his other publications in various languages. You have the Spanish version of the treaty, you have a Latin edition, and you have the Dutch edition. And the Dutch edition, again, is printed as an issue of the Nieuwe Tijdingen. And there's another type of publication that's included as an issue of the Nieuwe Tijdingen, which is not Verhoeven's own pamphlets, but other people's pamphlets that he translates and prints as part of the series. Much of his coverage of the Huguenot War in 1621 comes from pamphlets printed in Paris. Not all of it. There are letters from Paris that are clearly not published in Paris. For one thing, all the names of people and places have been italicized, sort of Italianized. So nobody in Paris is going to print the names of French peers with Italian spelling. But this is what Verhoeven's getting in Antwerp. Some of the time is letters being sent to him from Paris, presumably by an Italian. But then a lot of his coverage does come from French sources, but they're published French sources. Also published Spanish sources. His account of the Battle of Gibraltar is a translation of the version of the story printed in Seville by Francisco de Lira. I didn't have to do any research to find that out. Verhoeven says that in his text, first printed in Spanish. Oh, you can't see that, can you, if you're in the room? Will that? There we go. First printed in Spanish with license in Seville by Francisco de Lira, 1621. But something that then is possible with a serial publication that isn't possible with non-serial publication is a week later, he also gives the Dutch side. He has a report from the Netherlands about the shipping losses that have been suffered as a result of this battle. So the first news from Spain is about the great victory. The second news from Amsterdam reads more like an insurance bulletin telling you what ships have been lost. But that confirmation from the Netherlands that ships have been lost in this engagement it is a nice sort of thing that you can do, this inclusion of another perspective on the same story. Is something that you can do with serial publication that you can't do so much with occasional publication. And then there's another very different type. Now, what's happening there? There. There's another very different type of publication, of news publication, that is subsumed into the Nieuwe Tijdingen, and that's satirical writing, comic writing, reflective writing, all sorts of commentary upon the news, which you normally would not expect in a Zeitung or a Courant. That's not what they do, that's not what they're for. You can get pamphlets alongside them that do that, but not as part of the series, whereas Verhoeven incorporates this into the series. And with these illustrations, I think you could make a good case that these are the first newspaper cartoons, where you see Frederick of the Palatinate losing the Bohemian crown in the one. In the other, you can see the ministers of the Calvinist Church of Holland suckling at the teats of the beast of the apocalypse. So obviously, you know, it's a metaphorical image. You're not supposed to think this actually happened. So it is a sort of satire upon them. So there's all different, sorry, I'll come to that in a moment. So there's all different types of things that were part of news culture at the time appearing in the Nieuwe Tijdingen that would not normally have appeared in Zeitungen or Couranten or other serial news publications. So in that respect as well, it's not like other newspapers. Other newspapers don't have pictures, other newspapers don't have headlines, other newspapers don't have cartoons, commentary, satire, all the things that now you might normally expect to find somewhere in a newspaper. When Abraham Verhoeven was doing it, nobody else was doing newspapers like that. So this, I mean, this, what would you call it? Flexible hybrid publication is doing a lot of interesting things that, as far as I know, no other publishers of news at the time are doing. But, you know, you can correct me if I'm wrong. If you know of other publishers at the time who were doing that, then, you know, then I'd be delighted to hear about that. If you can bear with me for 5 more minutes, is that okay? There are 3 things I'd like to talk about, because that's my main message. I've just given you my conclusion. So, you know, if you're in a hurry to catch a bus, you can run for your bus. But there are 3 things that I'm curious about, or that I think are interesting, and that I'd like to draw your attention to, that Abraham Verhoeven does in 1621. One of these relates to the way that he reports on the attempted assassination of the King of Poland in November 1620. In 1621, pamphlets are published in Italy and in Germany reporting that Michał Piekarski, if my attempt to pronounce the name, I hope it's somewhere like what it should be. First of all, that Piekarski attempted to assassinate the King of Poland on the 15th of November, and then less than 2 weeks later, he suffered an exemplary, gruesome execution in which, you know, the hand that had shed the blood of the king was cut off and burnt, and, you know, all the rest of it. And he was, I think his corpse was pulled apart by horses at the end of it. I may be misremembering the details, but, you know, it's that type of thing that's happening. So in Italy and in Germany, you get both these stories in one pamphlet. Abraham Verhoeven gives you both these stories on the same day, but in 2 different publications, each of which is then eked out or beefed up, you know, sort of to make up the numbers. You get a few nondescript reports from Central Europe, from the Rhineland or from Hungary, where not a lot is actually happening. But in the one, you get the story, the shocking story of the attempted assassination of the King of Poland, and in the other, you get the shocking story of the gruesome execution of the would-be assassin. And he's split up what in Italy and in Germany is one pamphlet into 2 separate numbers, presumably on the basis that now you can sell 2 pamphlets to non-subscribers Whereas if you put all the shocking news from Poland in one and all the boring news from Central Europe in the other, you'd only be selling one pamphlet to non-subscribers rather than two. So this shows his business sense as a publisher and his somewhat adventurous approach to publishing as an entrepreneur. But then secondly, we have an example of his editorial caution. Oh, how does that? Is there any way of getting rid of this? Will clicking that get rid of it? No? Can I select something here? No? Oh. Okay, so have I just lost sound? No? You can still hear me, okay? Okay. So, first of all, on the 1st of October, he prints a letter from Vienna written on the 8th of September saying, news came here that Bethlen Gabor has been shot dead, but the truth of it is still unknown. We will inform the reader of the truth of it at the earliest. Bethlen Gabor, Prince of Transylvania, was besieging what we now call Bratislava, and his army was driven back from the walls of Bratislava, and then nothing was heard of him for a couple of weeks, and it was said that he was dead. In Lyon, in France, it was reported as fact that he was dead. There's a pamphlet with on the title page, Bethlen Gabor, Prince of Transylvania, has died. Well, the death of Bethlen Gabor, Prince of Transylvania, with the entire defeat of all his army by the Emperor's army, which is perhaps a bit of an exaggeration of what happened. But certainly Bethlen Gabor wasn't dead. He wouldn't die until 1629. On the 8th of October, you have Verhoeven reporting from the letter from Vienna that maybe he is dead. We haven't heard any more about him since last week when we reported that he was dead. But then on the 15th of October, 2 weeks after the initial report, it's contradicted. Not having heard any news of Bethlen Gabor, who had kept himself quiet for a while after being injured in his arm, it was thought he was dead, but he has recovered. So you can see there that one of the benefits of serial publication is you don't have to rush out the news that he's dead. You can wait and see, and then if it turns out not to be true, you're fine. Perhaps you're thinking, Abraham Verhoeven, good for him, very smart. Back in January, though, he'd made exactly the same mistake with the death of Elizabeth Stuart, the Countess Palatine, an English princess. There were reports that she had died, a letter from Nuremberg saying that she died, a letter from London saying that people were very sad about the report that she died. So Abraham Verhoeven put it on his front page with an image of somebody dead, giving it his editorial imprimatur when it wasn't true. So I think that later, when Bethlen Gabor's death is reported, he's learnt his lesson. He has good reason to be cautious at that stage. He doesn't want to make the same mistake again that he made with this other death. She actually died in 1660, I think, or some 40 years or more later. So it's not an accurate story at all. And finally, thirdly, issue 100 on the 9th of July, New Tidings from Spain. This is one where there's signs of censorship or self-censorship. There's something weird going on. On page 3, there's an incomplete sentence that breaks off at the bottom of the page, and page 4 starts with a new paragraph. And this is one of the issues that survives in more than one copy. If you look at the second copy, they've sort of completed the sentence, but then they've cut a bit out, the most curious part, and they've given the page a whole new layout. So in the first version, it says, since the death of Philip III, his eldest son has been reigning wisely as Philip IV, having come to the throne at the same age that King Solomon was when God gave him Israel, which is surely a good sign. The kingdom of Spain ruled with justice and righteous concern for the common good as the great troublemaker of thee, and then it cuts off dead. And the new paragraph starts, on the 24th of April, orders went out from court. The Inquisitor General has retired to the Priory of St. Dominic. The Duke of Reseda, eldest son of the Duke of Lerma, has been placed in a strong prison, and the news continues. In the second version, it sort of finishes that unfinished sentence. The Kingdom of Spain, ruled with justice and righteous concern for the common good, begins to flourish. So who was this troublemaker? Why were they mentioned? Where were they making trouble? There's a noun missing for that sentence to be complete, and there's a verb missing for that sentence to be complete. What exactly is happening there? You can also see on page 4, I mean, you wouldn't recognize it if you're not familiar with the Nieuwe Tijdingen, but this is unusual paragraph spacing. So he's cut 2 lines and he's moved the paragraphs a bit so that it's not that obvious. And then he's printed it, and then he's realized, oh no, there's a bit of the sentence left on page 3. I have to get rid of that as well. So he has to completely recast the first page with a new, bigger headline on page 3 to take up the room from what he's cut. So what is happening there? Who is this figure, this troublemaker? My suspicion, and it is just a suspicion, if any of you can contradict me and say, oh no, he's talking about this person, great, but my suspicion is that this is Rodrigo Calderón, who we heard so much about this morning. I was so grateful to you. That saves me so much exposition. But his sentence was issued in July, but it wasn't printed in Antwerp until November, after he was known to be dead. And then, a week after that, in November, they published the full story of his execution, translated from Spanish. And then, on the 15th of December, something that you wouldn't find in any other newspaper of the time, they print a reflective piece about the dangers of high office and the ephemeral nature of worldly glory, based on the life and miserable death of the Marquis of Ancre, of Rodrigo Calderón in Spain, and of Barneveld in Holland, and other favourites elsewhere. So it's making a sort of mini political philosophy issue of the Nieuwe Tijdingen as number 184, which again is something you would not find in any other newspaper. And it says Ancre and Calderón and Barneveld and other favourites, but it's mostly about Rodrigo Calderón. So if any of you happen to know what letter of news from Spain might have had this sentence in it, do by all means tell me. And if it's not about Rodrigo Calderón, I won't at all be unhappy. I'll just be delighted to know who this troublemaker was, who can't be identified in July. So we'll see. There you go. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. Muchísimas gracias. Damos paso ahora a las preguntas. Arthur.
Thank you so much. I was particularly impressed by the images that Verhoeven uses, and as you mentioned, this also sets him apart from contemporary news publications in Amsterdam or in Germany, for example, right? And I was wondering whether you think there is a kind of, let's say, systematic behind his use of imagery. In particular because for example, the issue of the Nieuwe Tijdingen that you gave us contains an image of a battlefield, which is the same image, if I'm not mistaken, as the one that Verhoeven used for his description of the war in Bohemia in May 1621, right? Yeah. One that you mentioned also in your presentation. Whereas for that war in Bohemia, his other publications use a different image. So it seems that he uses, or at least in this case, for the Nieuwe Tijdingen, a particular kind of war image for different wars as a kind of, perhaps a marker for his audience that this specific issue is going to be about warfare. Is that hypothesis, does it make sense if you look at the other issues of the Nieuwe Tijdingen, or is this pure coincidence, or is there perhaps something else behind his use of imagery that reveals something about the way he combines images with text in the specific genre of the Tijdingen as a news publication?
I haven't looked systematically, but also I haven't noticed any system to it. He has about half a dozen pictures of pitched battles in the field, of which this is one. He has about half a dozen pictures of sieges. He has a couple of pictures of generals giving commands or standing with a marshal's baton or whatever it may be. He has one that he reuses, this one here. Here it's the judges condemning Rodrigo Calderón. It's also used for the theologians meeting in the Synod of Dort. It's also used for parliamentarians meeting in Westminster. It's, basically, if it's people sitting talking, this is the image that he uses. If it's people fighting a battle, then he will use one of his many images of battles. This one of a naval battle he reuses for several different battles. That one of an execution, of Piekarski's execution and the portrait of the King of Poland, I haven't seen those reused, so I don't know what's going on there. And these are unique, and he doesn't reuse the Beast of the Apocalypse. Or there again you see the victory, the naval battle. Where are we? Here, this battle in front of a burning town, which looks to me very like a 16th or even 15th century image. That he's, there's no firearms in that picture, but he's recycling it as a picture of a battle. And he uses it for sieges in the Huguenot War, he uses it for sieges in the 30 Years' War, he uses it for things happening in Switzerland. It's just a picture of a battle outside a town. And I think what they do relate to is the news that he wants to draw attention to, the news that's in the headline. If he wants to draw your attention to news of a battle, and it might only be mentioned in one line in the text. So it's the newspaper contains several stories, one of which is a very brief mention of a victory somewhere, but that's what he wants to draw your attention to, is the victory. Then he'll say in the headline on the front page, with story of a victory against whoever, and the picture will be of a battle, even though most of the contents have nothing whatsoever to do with that battle. So it's partly his how would you say that? His strategy for directing the reader's attention to what the reader should think is important in the news, is what he uses the pictures for. But there's no systematic use of this image with this war or this image with that war or anything like that as far as I can tell. Is that? Yeah, okay.
Paul, I enjoy that enormously. One of the things that become very clear is the fact that this guy prints news in more than one language.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. It's pretty remarkable, I think. I mean, there are examples of other printers at the time who very occasionally do that, in other countries. But this is really remarkable. How many languages did he actually print in, and how do you explain this in relation to the consumption of the news?
Most of the vast majority of what he prints is in Dutch. And then French, he prints a bit in French, he prints a bit in Spanish, and he prints a bit in Latin. So it's mostly Dutch with a bit of French, a bit of Spanish, and a bit of Latin. Well, I would guess that the French and the Spanish, you have a number of Spanish speakers in Antwerp, merchants and people attached to the army. You have a number of Spanish speakers in Brussels, again, merchants and people attached to the court. And I would guess that those would be the primary readership for what he's publishing in Spanish. What he's publishing in Latin maybe has a wider readership. And we know that he's selling issues, but how many and how often we don't know. But that they sometimes crop up at Frankfurt or in Paris or in London. There are people in Lille, in Paris, and I think in Lyon, who print news pamphlets that are French translations of issues of the Nieuwe Tijdingen. Or maybe French copies of French publications by Verhoeven that no longer survive, that also appeared in Dutch as issues of the New Italian.
Thank you for a great talk, really. It was fantastic on many levels, and I also enjoyed very much. It was
Thank you.
very entertaining at the same time, so it was perfect. My question has to do with this 1605 date that you mentioned, that it was when he actually received the license or the authorization to print, and then you show that copper plate with the actual name of the person who gave the license. Is that correct?
Who signed the license for that image?
Yeah, I was, you know, it's quite unusual. Yeah, the Signat Bichere, he was the guy who actually gave the license. No, is that what you said? Or no, I misunderstood you, maybe?
I'm not sure if he signs the 1605 license. I'd have to double check.
Okay.
It may be. Or that he signs a license for this specific image.
Okay.
Possibly as well.
And this is pretty much the same year? Or is this later?
This is 1606.
Okay. And when he receives the license, do they use the Dutch equivalent to news? Or what? Do you remember what kind of?
Yeah, the license is a license. Well, I mean, it's really a monopoly. It's a privilege that he has. The privilege, he alone has the privilege of printing news of victories. That's what he has a license for, news of victories. But he interprets this very broadly. What he actually prints is not by any means always news of victories, but that's what he has a license to print.
That's fantastic. Thank you very much.
Can I, yeah. Now mine is actually a very quick question, and it's about Mireus. When you said that the librarian had this role also in conveying propaganda, because Mireus, he had at this time also correspondence with the librarian in Vienna, Sebastian Tengnagel, and we have been digging into his correspondence a lot in a research project I'm carrying on in Vienna, not on the news, so on the side of the library. But there are these letters of Mireus, and many letters with other libraries, and we struggle a bit in order to define a bit better this propagandistic role of the librarian. So I wanted to force you to tell me something more about this.
I wish I could.
Yeah. So because it remains very ephemera, this role. Also Tengnagel, he does a lot in terms of collection of the news. Also Hugo Blotz, before him, he had collected several news shared with the Fuggers. After him, Tengnagel, he collects news in German, also about the war, and he writes stories for the emperor. But so I wanted to ask your opinion on that. So where does this idea for you comes from? And
where does the idea come from?
Yeah, the idea that they are important element in the propaganda.
Seeing that Mireus is a court librarian who's involved in it, seeing that the court librarian in Heidelberg is involved in disseminating propaganda to the opposite effect. And there was another one whose name escapes me, but I've come across 3 court librarians all doing this, which perhaps it's foolish of me to say on the basis of this, court librarians play a role in the dissemination of propaganda. But certainly some of them do, and it does look to me as though that's expected of them, as though that's sort of part of their job.
Because Mireus was at the time at the search of these Austrian documents from the Middle Age in order to find like some Habsburg
he was an antiquarian primarily. I mean, he was one of Justus Lipsius's students, and he wrote the first biography of Justus Lipsius, so I mean, he's very sort of Lipsian figure.
Yeah.
And he mostly what he does is antiquarian writings about religious orders, about orders of knighthood, about noble houses. And he publishes a book about the genealogy of Spinola as well, and you know, all of Spinola's famous ancestors and relatives. I'm not sure how. I'm not sure if all of them were actually related to Spinola, but it makes a good genealogy.
Yeah.
And so news is a very tiny part of what he's producing, but it is part of what he's producing. So, and what he's producing more broadly definitely has propagandistic uses. Even if it's not framed as propaganda, it's framed as the history of a religious order or the history of a noble house, or, but it sort of always has an intent. And it's the same with the news. When he's writing a biography of Philip III, it's to present matters in a certain light, which I would guess corresponds with how the archdukes want matters to be seen. But that's a guess.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you. No, it makes sense.
But I want to hear more from you about court librarians in Vienna now.
I'm trying to quit.
Just a question about the license or the privilege thing. Did you say that he had a privilege, but it was a monopoly? There were any other printers in Antwerp?
That's right. He was licensed to print news of victories, and all other printers were prohibited from counterfeiting the same.
And there were any other printers in Antwerp writing, publishing news books or news pamphlets?
Not after about 1615.
Oh, it's quite remarkable.
From 1620 to 1630, maybe 1632, he effectively has a monopoly in Antwerp. There are people elsewhere in the dominions of the Archduchess Isabella, or that she was governess of at that stage. You'll get them reprinted in Lille or reprinted in Brussels, but in Antwerp, he's cornered the market. He effectively has a monopoly on newsprinting.
And do you think that it's maybe a kind of control by the authorities? The fact that being the one only printer in a city like Antwerp, because it's a kind of way of control the
definitely, yes. Yes, it's definitely
the fact that there's only a printer.
And you can see from his career in 1629, he's ordered to cease printing news, and then through the 1630s, the government pretty systematically puts him out of business. And the reason that he goes, Andrew Pettigrew has published an article about Abraham Verhoeven in which he says that Verhoeven's failure shows that he had a poor business plan, that this wasn't a profitable way of printing news. But I think when you have the government after you, that's not the main issue, it's how good your business plan is. It's, because the licensing regulations, the laws on the book trade were applied rigorously to him and not to any other printers. So that they're forcing him out of business. Somebody in the central government, and I think I know who, or at least who they're connected to. It has to do with the whole shift of power in Brussels sort of through the mid-1620s into the early 1630s, especially after Spinola leaves in 1628. That there's a whole circle of people around Spinola in 1620 who are backing Verhoeven or protecting Verhoeven. And then a decade later, in 1630, several of them are dead, some of them have left the Low Countries, some of them are no longer connected to the court, so there's a Jesuit who was connected to the court, but then he was sent off to be head of a Jesuit house somewhere else to dissociate him from the court. So that there's a whole shift in who's in power in Brussels, and they turn against Verhoeven in the early 1630s, and sort of systematically put him out of business, which is, So yeah, it is. And what's interesting is that he's not put out of business straight away. They have to apply pressure. They have to ratchet up, the heat on Verhoeven. So it looks to me like something factional, that the people who are protecting Verhoeven are not as powerful as they were, but he still does have some protection, or he wouldn't be printing news in 1632, 1633. So there's something weird going on there, and it certainly has to do with control, and who gets to control who's printing the news is also something that's at stake.
Thank you.
It's a very small question. Could you please go to the slide where the Spanish relation on Don Fadrique and the victory is? There, this one. Yeah. Coming back to the first question, I find remarkable that that is a coat of arms of Charles V that is 70 years old by that time. And I found a relación in Málaga in 1620 with the same coat of arms, and I thought it was strange to have an old image for this, but maybe it's usual, or you have more examples of this imperial coat of arms in the 20s?
Oh yeah, no, I mean, a lot of his images are old. And I think several of his images are 16th century, and that one I showed you I think might even be 15th century. I'm pretty sure I've seen something like that being used for the siege of Nancy in 1477. So I mean, it might not be a 15th century image, it might be a 16th century image of a 15th century event. But yeah, a lot of these images are old. He's reusing them. I would suspect he's buying up stock of old woodcuts that he can use. He's maybe recarving the ones that he likes. Because this is, I mean, it may be an old battle, but it's a beautiful picture. I mean, if you had to carve a new picture of a battle at sea, why would you? You have this one. It's beautiful. So, but yeah, there's no, even one, I thought that his image of the murder of the Duke of Buckingham was unique. It's only used once in the Nieuwe Tijdingen, but then I was, having actually said that in my doctorate, that this was one of the unique images that he cut especially, showed the murder of the Duke of Buckingham. And then a few years later, I found exactly that image being used in 1614 to show the murder of a jeweler in Amsterdam. So they're old images. Even the ones I thought were new images turn out to be old images that he's reusing. I mean, I don't know that there are any quite this old, and the one that shows what I think is the siege of Nancy. I mean, those are old images. Oh, there's also one of Crusaders and Saracens fighting in a desert. And he uses that, and he uses that 4 or 5 times for battles happening in Europe in the 17th century. But he uses that image. I've written a whole article about why he does that I won't bore you with now. But yeah, the images are I want an art historian to look at them properly, really. That would be so nice if an art historian went through them and saw, just how many are there, which ones does he use when, where do they come from. But I don't know that I could interest an art historian in doing that. It's not Rubens, is it?
Gracias. Just to add up to this, what is striking here is that the coat of arms is used for the Spanish publication in Sevilla. I think there's many of these cases in Spain, in Spanish America as well, where the coat of arms is, I think Carmen has written on this, right? Where the coat of arms of the monarchy is used to sort of give authority to the publication. But apparently in Antwerp, even though it's of course part of the Spanish Netherlands, it is part of the Spanish monarchy, that coat of arms is not used, at least not by Verhoeven, right? So there is, when it comes to giving authority to the news, there seems to be a different strategy, although the one here is indeed already undermining my point.
But there are counter-examples. But yeah, I mean, he does sometimes use coats of arms. I mean, this is an English edict translated into Dutch. It has the English royal arms. He uses the French royal arms. He uses the emblem of the Medici. He will use heraldic images, but he far prefers action pictures. That's certain. I mean, if he can use an action picture, he'll use an action picture. If he can use a battle or a siege or anything like that, then that's what's going on the front. I think also to avoid confusion, because very often laws are printed with the royal arms on the front, and he's not printing laws, except when he is, but then it's translations of laws from other places. So I wonder if that might have something to do with it.
Thanks.